Well, welcome everybody. My name is Phil Taub, and along with my partner from Nixon Peabody, Chris Keefe, we're very glad to welcome you here. I think this is session number 12, and for those of you that have been joining us each and every week, thank you very much. As you know, we recently went to every other week. We were doing these every week. I think we did 11 in a row, going every other week. And as you know, we have been trying each week to bring you the latest on all things stimulus, including the PPP money. We've also had some amazing panelists over the period of the last 11 weeks or so, talking about various parts of the market, what they're seeing in their specialty areas, how COVID has affected what they're seeing, and thinking and talking a lot about what we anticipate is going to be happening in the future. And what we wanted to do this week, what Chris and I wanted to do, was bring back three of our top panelists and ask them, okay, so we heard what you said 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago or 10 weeks ago. Tell us what you're seeing now, and be very interesting to sort of go back and compare to that. So we're very happy, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel. You should be able to see their names here on the screen, but let me go through and introduce them. So Michael Franco, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Citus AMC, which is a leading provider of consulting, outsourcing, talent, and technology services to institutional lenders and investors in commercial and residential real estate. Jeremy Hitchcock, who is the founder of Minim, an AI-driven Wi-Fi management and IoT security platform for service providers. Jeremy does many things. He also co-founded and was the CEO for a long time at Dyn, which ultimately he sold to Oracle a number of years ago. And then Barry Knapp, who's the managing partner at Ironsides, Ironsides Macroeconomics LLC. Barry was formerly the chief strategist at Barclays, the head of public policy at the Guggenheim, and is a frequent contributor at CNBC and Bloomberg. So we're very happy, Chris and I, to be welcoming Michael, Jeremy, and Barry. But we're going to start with our partner, Rob Drobnak, who is a partner in our Chicago office and is substituting today, but I'm sure will do a great job for Morgan Nyan, who appears most days. Chris and I have a couple questions for Rob on the latest on the PPP and a few other things. And if we don't answer your particular question, please go ahead and type that into the Q&A box. And Rob's going to stay on through the whole course of this hour, and we'll reply to you in the Q&A box as well. So don't be shy about asking him questions. All right, so Chris, let's get this going. I think you'll start us off with the first question for Rob.
Terrific. So, Rob, there's been a lot of press this week about there still being money remaining in the till, so to speak, for the PPP program. If we've got a number of participants on the line, I'm sure some are wondering, if I haven't yet pulled the trigger for a PPP loan, can I still apply?
Yes, you have about a month. The president passed legislation, I think, over the weekend, and you have until August 8th to apply, and there's about $130 billion or so available. And, one of the things that I think people need to consider is, with all the press reports this week, depending upon the size of your loan, there's going to be some information disclosed, and the public will know that you applied for a loan and the dollar amount in a range if you received it. And then that's the floor is 150K. So if you're above that, it'll be disclosed with your name. If you're below that, while it'll be disclosed, you won't be identified by individual company. It'll just be grouped in with state level disclosures.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate that. So, Rob, I understand that Congress and the President passed some legislation to benefit borrowers and potential borrowers under the PPP program, the so-called Flexibility Act. And so I wanted to ask you some questions about that, including, do you automatically receive, the extended maturity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. If you haven't applied yet and you do so now, you will get the benefit of that 5-year extension. Just as a reminder, when the CARES Act was passed and the SBA issued the documentation for obtaining a loan, they set the maturity date at 2 years. So if you apply now, you get the 5 years. And actually, if you applied before now, but after the passage of that Flexibility Act, you also get the benefit automatically. If, however, you were one of the early movers, then the 5 years is open to you, but it's only open to you if you can reach an agreement with your lender. So in that circumstance, you're going to be probably preparing the forgiveness application now, or if you chose to exercise one of your other options under the Flexibility Act, which was to choose a longer covered period. If you're going to be processing the application, I think that's the perfect time to be having a dialogue with your lender about what the maturity date should be.
So Rob, talk to us a little bit more about the forgiveness timeline and how people should be thinking about that, because I think that's becoming a area where people are starting to pay attention now that they've utilized a lot of the PPP funding.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was really one of the, if not the core feature of obtaining and seeking a PPP loan. And what the SBA has done is they've issued an application, and once you fill it out, you have to submit it through your lender, and they're the first person that's going to review it. And by statute, they have 60 days to review it. Once they're done with that review process, then they send it to the SBA, and then the SBA has up to 90 days to respond and send money to the lender in the amount equal to the forgiveness. So that's 150 days potentially from when you as the borrower submit the application. But the good news is that lenders are incentivized, if you have a smaller dollar size of your loan, to process this quickly. And they've told us that they plan on trying to do that within 10 to 14 days. And I mention the small dollar size purposely because the SBA has come out and said they're going to do reviews automatically of all loans above $2 million. So the process I just described, the 60 days and the 90 days, is what governs if there's not an SBA review. So the SBA review could take longer, and so you may have longer to wait if you are a borrower that obtained more than $2 million. And one other thing just to point out on the review process, the SBA has reserved the right to review any loan application. So it's not just those above $2 million. They may review those that are below that threshold. And, you know, one of the things that has been talked about this week is that famous people or wealthy people that are associated with a business that obtained a PPP loan, there's a lot of questions as to whether or not they should have obtained it. And so there's talk that there will be an incentive for the SBA to review those businesses, even if they fall under the $2 million threshold.
So, Rob, forgiveness is obviously, the critical issue right now. On a side note, Chris and I are doing deals again. We're seeing a lot more M&A deals. One of the questions that's coming up, is, if you do an M&A deal and have a change of control, whether you can still seek forgiveness. But before we get to that, the question I have for you is, originally there was an 8-week period, right, to spend the money. And then later, Congress came out and said, no, now actually there's a 24-week period, right? And so one question I see that comes up a lot is there something in between the 8 and the 24? Like, because a lot of folks was trying to spend it in 8, but could spend it in 10 or 12. Like, what is your view between the 8 and the 24 months? The 24 weeks.
You're right. That's unfortunately, it's binary. It's either 8 or 24. There's not an in-between number that you could choose. So while, yes, it's some flexibility, it's not as much flexibility as would probably be best situated for the borrower. And the relevance in part to that covered period is not just that's how long you have to expend funds and count it towards your forgiveness amount, but remember that's also a relevant period for which you have to maintain employment levels and compensation levels for employees. And then if you fall below those numbers from what you were in a prior period, then your forgiveness amount is adjusted downward. So I think for a lot of borrowers, yeah, you may be able to obtain a higher amount of forgiveness based on the initial calc if you choose to go with the 24-week period, but there's also some additional carrying costs associated with that from a payroll perspective. And depending upon how well your business is operating, that'll be a decision that each company needs to make before just automatically going with the 24-week option.
So Rob, if your organization has made a decision about what forgiveness period to shoot for, do you actually have to wait until the end of the forgiveness period to make your application for forgiveness?
You don't. You can go ahead and apply at any time, even if, say, you chose the 24-week and you used all your funds through the 16-week period. You can go ahead and apply at that 16th week. The issue, though, as I was alluding to earlier, is the covered period has some other relevancy in the PPP loan program, and one of them is the amount of compensation you pay for your employees during that entire period. So while, yes, you can start the ball rolling on your process for receiving forgiveness early, you're still going to be deemed to have to pay payroll through the end of that period.
Well, Rob, thank you. We're going to turn it over to Michael here in a minute, but I see that a number of our audience members have already started to type in questions. So appreciate you sticking around answering those questions online here in the Q&A box. And again, encourage anyone else that has questions to continue to type them in, and Rob will stay on. So thank you, Rob.
Welcome. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Michael, welcome back. Great to have you and great to see you again here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Michael, as you listen to us asking Rob about the Paycheck Protection Plan program, I think you have sort of a unique view from where you sit. You know, I'd love to just hear your general reaction to, you know, did it work? Did it not work? Why didn't it work? Or, you know, great to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I mean, we helped out a number of institutions that were involved in the process and the fulfillment, you know, of these applications. And I mean, from our perspective, there's kind of a misalignment here between the public perception of what was being done and, you know, what was trying to get accomplished. And you knew it was going to be a highly politicized type of, you know, thing. And I think Rob was bringing up, you've got millionaires and billionaires now who are getting called out and saying, you know, why did they get a PPP loan? I think everybody should have recognized that there was going to be a lot of externalities created when you establish a program over, you know, a few days and roll it out in an entity that really isn't staffed to administer it in any sort of way. The way that we describe it internally is that, you know, it's a snow blizzard and there's going to be mounds of snow that pile up in some areas. And that's just because the wind blew them there. It's not because there's anything special about those areas. And what I mean by that is there's going to be externalities. There's going to be people who get things that people think is unjust, that they shouldn't have gotten them. But that's just part of doing a big government program. And the question that we really have to ask ourselves is, are we as a nation and is the economy better off because the program existed, or is it better that the program didn't exist? And if we don't like what happened this time, what would we change the next time? Because, you know, there's a chance you might need to have a big scale project or program like this again. What if there's another outbreak? What if there's another downturn? You know, what if there's another great recession? You know, having answers to how we want to roll out these programs and what went right and what went wrong is really important for public policy moving forward.
So, Michael, Wendell Davis was on, the regional administrator for the SBA here in New England, was on a number of our programs sort of early on in this series, and talked about exactly to your point, while nothing is perfect, the SBA really was successful in putting out a tremendous amount of capital in a relatively short period of time without really the architecture to do it. And by and large, from a statistical standpoint, a lot of that money went to the people to whom it was intended. We're all very aware of the stories in the news about people who are well-heeled, whose businesses may have received assistance. But, looking at the totality of the program and the program funding, does the fact that there are some of these outliers or, potentially, unfit recipients sort of cause the program to be a failure?
I don't think so, but I know that there's going to be, a political story, around it being potentially a failure because of that. When you take a look at other policy steps that were taken as well, like the $600 a week and, extra payments as part of unemployment insurance. There were definitely people who probably didn't warrant getting $600 a week in, extra employment insurance. Is that a failure because some of those individuals, got additional money? And there might have been more money that was inappropriately allocated there than there was through the PPP program. You just won't see those stories, out in the news because it's too many small individual instances. You'll hear a general narrative of a disincentive to work, but you won't hear, individuals getting called out necessarily and shamed. So I don't think that the program was necessarily a failure. I do think that it had a high degree of externalities associated with it, and there's probably things that they could have tweaked and they would tweak and anything, moving forward. But just the fact that there is so much still left in PPP funds that were untapped shows you how scared the public was in drawing down the money for fear of, your company name appearing in a Excel spreadsheet posted on the SBA website that anybody can download.
Yeah, it's a good point, Michael. I mean, it's interesting that there's actually still money left over, which seems, inconsistent with how many folks and businesses we know that are struggling right now, or would, maybe they did get money, they'd like more money. But I want to ask you about government involvement and intervention in real estate, right? Your particular area of specialty. So, I don't know all the particulars. Maybe you can help us understand, what specifically the federal government has done and some state governments have done, to get more involved in real estate finance. And is that a trend, that we should expect to see continue?
Yeah, I would definitely say yes, it's a trend that you would expect to, see continue. Usually when items are created, new tools are created, they don't get put down. They tend to be continually utilized whenever the need arises. So if you take a look at it, there's been a lot of different ways you could think about the involvement, here already through Fannie and Freddie on the single family side and Ginnie Mae and all the other government, programs and acronyms you could come up with. That's about 65% of the overall mortgages outstanding, in the U.S. And on the multifamily side, Fannie and Freddie and agency are also 20%. Of all of that market as well. So you have a large entrenched, government position, and certainly with the flow of mortgage credit, it's an even higher percentage of loans that are being originated today that are obviously going towards an agency, type of execution. So what did they do here? Well, through the CARES Act, as is well documented, you kind of have eviction and foreclosure moratoriums. You've got forbearance agreements, that were extended or put into, place. And that could only apply to government insured or backed or owned, mortgages, because otherwise you would be interfering with contract law. But what does that do? Well, the banks got the memo the last time that if you're not willing to play ball with whatever the government's going to do, you're going to end up with a lot of additional regulations. All the CEOs are going to get called in front of Congress. You're going to be vilified, and your reputation is going to be ruined. So they've all tried to focus on being as accommodative, as possible here. Some of the banks even went as far as to have, a couple clicks on the website and you got forbearance. It was very, very easy, to get forbearance, whether it was a government-backed loan or not. So you've really seen the forbearance numbers, tick up. Question is that going to continue? It was supposed to go through the end of June. It was pushed out until the end of August. Could that go further? And I think the answer is probably yes. The House has already passed 2 measures that would push out these moratoriums, significantly further. There was one act that was proposed by Maxine Waters that was passed that would push out moratoriums until the end of March. That's not going to get past, the Senate, but it just lets you know kind of where the priorities are. And as you take a look at what the FHFA could do on a unilateral basis to push out those moratoriums further, there's going to be a lot of political pressure to do that. And the fact that the country still is seeing an uptick in total cases, right, with what's happening in several states, just adds to that pressure for the government to continue to allow forbearance to permeate and for the moratoriums to also exist. And that's pushed into the multifamily side as well, where if you're not evicting, you can't evict, but also if the multifamily owners provide forbearance to their renters, they could get forbearance on their mortgages.
Michael, you were, the last time you were with us, had some really, I think, insightful sort of data-driven analysis about the burgeoning impact of this time on the commercial real estate space. What are you seeing as of today, and how are markets continuing to adjust?
Yeah, commercial real estate on the debt side has started to bounce back a little bit. So if you wanted to take a look at the CMBS markets, as a for instance, CMBS spreads have definitely noticeably tightened. Are they in and back to where they were in January? The answers are no. But have they tightened significantly on the AAA side? Absolutely. Are there new issuance going out? Yes. A lot of that new issuance activity, though, is still 80% of the loans are pre-COVID and they're being sanitized. So you're not seeing the retail, the hotel, hospitality exposure that you would have seen in pools that were pre-COVID. And the average deal size is getting smaller. So people are looking to clear the exposure that they have currently on the balance sheets and then start lending again. I've had a number of calls even today with clients who are looking to get into the market to extend credit, in a lot of these areas. That being said, there's also segments that have some real issues that are going to take a while to work out. As a for instance, regional malls, especially B and C malls, estimates are anywhere from 15 to 30% of those malls could disappear here over the course of the next few years. We've already seen some large retail bankruptcies. Brooks Brothers filed this week. You're going to continue to see that trend, happening. What happens though is you have co-tenancy issues. So you've seen some of the larger mall operators actually offer to buy into these retailers. And the reason is because they might have clauses in their leases that if that retailer leaves that space, it would allow for repricing of all of the rents across all of the tenants, or it could allow people to actually leave the leases. So it could accelerate the death spiral if some of these institutions, some of these retailers aren't coming back. Away from that, in hospitality, I think we know hotels have had some problems. RevPAR, or revenue per available room, so the revenue side of things, is down 95%. It's been ticking back up, but as we see these hotspots of COVID reemerge, it certainly pushes that back out. Destination hotels, people have to feel comfortable flying, again, in order to get there. So it's not a real great service, story right now for those hotels. One of the things that I can tell you that you will see is that your hotel experience, when next time you start going to a hotel, may look different than what it was, historically. Things like breakfast buffets, are you going to have that anymore? Probably not. So a lot of the stuff that was common with a limited service hotel, you may not see those features anymore. And the things that were common with a full service hotel, like having a restaurant on site. Restaurants on site for hotels typically don't make sense unless the occupancy is going to be like 80% or something like that. So these hotels are really looking to cut back on those expense structures. So even staying at a property that you may know, 2 years from now or a year from now, it may be a different experience than what you have had historically.
Michael, that's a great example, just sort of looking forward. So just sort of more generally, love to hear what you're thinking about permanent changes in commercial real estate, right? What does the pandemic change forever? I think that's probably a good example, but give us some other insights into this.
Yeah, there's been a lot of interesting conversations as far as, what can we do with, some of this commercial real estate that's out there. If you think that we have too much commercial real estate right now, like the malls are a great example, 15 to 30% of those malls are going to go away. What's going to happen, to those assets? People are talking about potentially repositioning some of those into, more multifamily type of use, mixed use type of properties. Maybe you come up with a different office layout or configuration potentially around, those malls. That has happened historically where malls have died and it's become more of an office park, if you will. I think that you'll see that. On the office side, it's even more interesting. There's kind of this push-pull where you're hearing people say work from home is here. It's going to become a bigger part of the overall trend, and therefore we're all going to need less office space. And then the pushback is people are going to want to have more office space in their spaces. So the number of square foot per person, potentially increases. So if I'm going to have larger spacing for everybody in my office, and that needs to go up by 25% or 50%, 25 or 50% of those people can work from home, and I'm net neutral on the amount of office space that I need. So it's really interesting to see the way that that's going to end up. Last thing that I'll leave you with is the co-working. We're actually a little bit more constructive on co-working longer term. If you think of some of the knock-on effects, like a WeWork, are they going to make it? Speculative. But if you think about more people working from home, but maybe not having a setup to work from home, they're going to want to go into some sort of local office co-working type of environment potentially. So co-working may change, but it's probably a trend that may accelerate in some areas just as people potentially work from home, but still need another space.
Michael, thank you. That's a perfect segue to turn to Jeremy for a few minutes. Jeremy, you had, I think, some great insight on sort of how worker interaction with customers and workflow process was changing in the immediate wake of the pandemic. What are you continuing to see with respect to a remote workforce? Jeremy, I think you're on mute.
All right, there we go.
There he is.
Is a brave new world. A lot of companies are trying to figure out what does that mean. Deliberate and longer term view into their return to work plans. I think smaller companies are starting to go back to work in some form or function. I think every state's a little bit different, and so large multinational companies that have footprint in lots of different places are trying to figure out how to normalize their policies and rules. But I think everybody 3 months later is an expert in WebEx, Zoom, and a lot of video conferencing software that we weren't as familiar with. And I think a lot of us are seeing that it's, in some cases, highly effective, maybe not parity, but certainly for getting the job done with the group of people that is certainly a highly effective tool, and it's going to be here to stay for a while.
Jeremy, thanks for coming back. Appreciate having you on here again. Appreciate your time. So I want to ask you about tech companies, something you know a lot about. You own some tech companies. You've started some, sold some, and it's an interesting time to be in a tech company, especially those that are in heavy tailwind markets. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, it's definitely a tale of two cities, because there's a group of companies who have been trying to change logistics, travel, leisure, and those companies, if they're on the right side of the trends, they are. Was looking at a board deck for one, and they're up 300%, and already a pretty good size and scale. And then there are others who are 10% what they were last year, and it really depends. I think when the first weeks came through, people were saying, well, this COVID thing, it just accelerates all the trends. I'm playing in a big market space, and so I can win. Clearly, if you were in some type of travel business, a lot of those companies have thought long and hard about their future. I think there's been some that have shut down. Companies who have had the ability to raise money are looking at how to do that. And when you look at the deals that are done, you're seeing probably the price of quality is much higher. But it's something that I think a lot of organizations are trying to focus on their core. They're trying to be competitive, and they're also trying to be flexible, because I think a lot of organizations are of the mindset that we just don't know how everything shakes out, and there's still more to come. And that has a lot of people, I think, a little tense about what they do. And it's for many companies, I think, making them question what growth opportunities they have, and just more focusing on, well, how do we get to profitability faster? How do we trade growth for profitability and a more sustained cash flow?
Jeremy, from the entrepreneur's perspective and the investor's perspective, how successful has the PPP been, and any number of the other related programs that both state and federal governments have launched to try and smooth the waters?
Yeah, PPP in tech is a really fascinating one. I mean, Michael talked about the politicalization that took place, and I would say that the tech community and the venture capitalist community was really torn on whether or not PPP applied to a high growth tech company. Company that might have a year of cash on a balance sheet or a few years of cash on a balance sheet, knew they wanted to invest ahead of growth. And there was a whole question of optics. And that was in some ways contrasted with a bunch of, LP-backed organizations that have, ties of high net worth, who are investing in partners who are typically not at VCs, that are not considered in the popular press as these warm and fuzzy people. And so they were worried about the optics of it. And so there was a lot of conflicting advice and questions on whether or not, for what are arguably small businesses, they employ dozens to small hundreds of employees, whether they should apply for these. And so I think in the early phases, there was a pretty large push for many of them to not apply. And, there was a lot of back and forth on whether some of the funders were saying, hey, don't apply, but they themselves were applying, and it created a whole bunch of a mess. But, first person experience was it allowed us to take on and keep on some growth opportunities and employees that we would have otherwise said, you know what, as we're readjusting our plans and preparing for the future, we would have made different decisions if not for the PPP program. And so I think the companies who did do that are not shameless at all about the fact that they applied, and they're, I think the program, to some of the commentary earlier, it was SBA normally does, I think, a tenth or some small fraction of what they normally do in a month, what they typically do in a year. And so they do 10x the volume. There's going to be things that are not well understood at scale and all these other things. But for the most part, I think it was for that community, it was seen as a real positive.
So, Jeremy, I want to ask you about education, something you know a lot about as well. In my house, the main topic of discussion is my daughter going to college in the fall? So she, like many other kids, was a senior in high school when COVID started, and we watched the prom go away and school go remote and no graduation or virtual graduation. And Then summer camp was canceled, which was supposed to be a counselor, and kind of holding on to the fact that college is in fact going to start on time. And she's going to a private school. My assumption is they need the money, and unlike the contrast to the public schools where they're in a slightly different situation and there's more politics there and so forth. So we're watching with bated breath every announcement that comes out. I think yesterday the Ivy Leagues announced that there's going to be no sports. Some of the Ivies are only letting freshmen, onto campus and so forth. But tell us what you think the consensus is, K through 12, and then of course the college ranks as well.
Well, if you're just asking about what the consensus is in education, that's easy. There's none. And, unlike in the tech community where there's probably going to be a funding crunch of some form, whether it's different from normal, hard to tell. Everyone talked about a Series A crunch, 5 years ago, and just the funding just kind of pushed along. There probably will be a crunch that we'll see at some point. That day of reckoning is going to come. I think that the longer term impact in what higher education looks like, both in private and public institutions, is I don't know what the right word to say is, but scary is probably the only thing I could think of. State budgets are coming in, depending upon what state you're in, 25, 40%, 10% down from normal revenues. And so there's already been this multi-year decline in the percentage of the revenue mix that public institutions receive from their local or state government. That's going to continue to accelerate. You have the very nature of an educational institution is typically to bring people together from multiple locations to bring them to a single campus to learn. And so an epidemiologist would say that is the antithesis of what we should be doing. And so I think higher ed institutions are really between a rock and a hard place, because they know that for years the price of tuition has been a boiling frog, goes up faster than inflation. There's financial aid and a whole bunch of other mechanisms that have allowed that pricing to continue. But are you going to be comfortable as a parent with your daughter, for example, sitting at home doing the same experience for the same price if that's the decision, if they don't actually send people to campus? And I think a lot of institutions are trying to figure out what's going to happen. Many of them are having to make decisions now just because of the logistical challenges of students showing up and what does it mean. And many of them also feel strongly about their international community. And so some of the immigration policies that are coming out about different types of visa statuses are also being challenged. So I think that's a mess, and K through 12 institutions are no different. They're having to make those same type of decisions, and so workforce is probably less flexible to adopting technology. So I think, long story short, it's not going to be normal in the fall by any means. It's closer to what we saw in March and April than it will be what it was last year. And I wouldn't be surprised to see 2 steps forward, 5 or 6 steps back, where if there's a bunch of outbreaks that happen, there's going to be a whole set of schools and students that close and go home. And you just have to adjust to what the new normal is. But it's kind of the last point I'll make is they're one of the institutions I'm involved in. They have years and years of research that they've been working on biological on samples that very much for this purpose of looking for cures to bad things. And some of that stuff gets lost because of the quarantine rules of not being able to properly maintain those things. So it's it's a mess, I think, is the best way. And there's no consensus on what should be the right path forward, because I think we're all still trying to learn what's the best way.
So Jeremy, when I go back and play this recording for my daughter, you're in big trouble, just so you know. So the follow-up question to that is, look, in our backyard in New Hampshire, Southern New Hampshire University has been a world leader, right, in remote learning. I think they've got 3,000 students on campus and like 125,000 students online, which is amazing. The Ivy Leagues, which arguably put out some of the best content out there, have been reluctant to go to that model, right? Maybe that waters down their brand or something, they take that exclusivity away. Do you think this pandemic, you think this is sort of a point now where maybe an MIT or an Ivy, whatever, this is when they do it?
I think if there's another year of this, there's going to be a likelihood that we're going to see not just a shift in how education is both conducted, but also where it's conducted. So I think that it makes everybody feel better if you look back in the March, April, May timeframe, and we ran 2 experiments in education. We shifted when education happened, so it was like TiVo, you could watch it whenever. And then the other issue was it got recombinated in different ways, so it became a la carte. So people got used to, and I use this analogy a couple times, and it's probably been one of the ways in which you can understand that there's been both a curricular and instructional delivery change. And so it might sound like, oh, okay, it's not that big of a deal, but instead of waking up, students were in a seat at 8 o'clock. They finished their schoolwork at 2:30, and so it was just a place shiftment. We actually had a place shipment because we were at home. We changed the place. Instead of being in school, we were at home in our home environment. And the way in which we consumed and we did our assignments was completely different. And so there were these two fundamental changes that took place at the same time. And honestly, when you have any sort of disruptive innovation, you typically have to unbundle things. And so, ed tech people are jumping up and down because homeschooling's all different. There's a whole range of charter schools for higher ed. There's more skill-based activities that are going on, especially with the prospect of 15, 20% unemployment. So it's probably the time that some of these schools are going to get more serious about what online means. But, I can tell you that SNHU has had 15 years to perfect the model that is largely a place-shifted and instructional delivery model. So it took, and everybody else had to do that in 3 months, what they've done in 15 years. So I'm going to be a lot more optimistic that people are going to look for not this grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, or I'm going to go get a major in college. I'm going to go get a master's in this. And they're instead going to be something that's much more skill-based, apprentice-based, or work-based. And as people are thinking about gap years, some of those numbers, instead of, it's about 3% people that go on a gap year, that number might be anywhere between 10 and 15%. Maybe it's higher, maybe it's lower. I think that's where the innovation will actually take place.
Jeremy, thank you. As always, pretty darn thought-provoking when you're talking about those numbers. That's a pretty massive shift in a very short period of time. Turning to Barry. Barry, a lot of economists and strategists have talked about this as being a very unprecedented time, but when you were with us last, you I think you saw a little bit more of a correlation between some turbulent times in the U.S. economy in the past, and in particular, sort of the sharp and short recessions of 58 and 80. Sitting where you are now today, a little further down the pike, do you still believe those are relevant to the current situation? What are you seeing in terms of the performance of this contraction? Barry, I'm not getting any audio from you, Barry. I'm sorry. No, still nothing. Maybe we click back off mute. Yeah.
No. Susan, can you help us with this?
Unfortunately, I think it's on Barry's end.
No, Barry, we cannot hear you. Barry, I don't know, you may need to do something there on your end. You got it? No, we still can't hear you. Why don't we do this? Yeah, Chris, I've got.
I could do our sort of wrap up and our recap of what we've got coming up while Barry gets sorted. How about that?
Yeah, or I've got like 10 more questions for Michael, so we'll go through those.
Well, why don't I do the commercial for what we've got coming up, and then we'll turn to Michael.
Okay.
And we can
we'll try to get Barry back.
Terrific. So as all of our participants know, you'll be able to find a recording of this session and our previous sessions on our website, www.nixonpeabody.com. We've got a couple of great programs upcoming next week on Thursday, July 16th. We're hosting a private equity secondary market update for general partners, limited partners. And on July 28th, we're bringing our popular Let's Talk series virtual. And we host a conversation with Laura Vanderkam, who's a notable writer, author, and speaker. Our Let's Talk series features dynamic female leaders across all industries, inviting them to speak about their career journey and their path to leadership. You can access all those programs as well as sign up for alerts at nixonpeabody.com. And it sounds like we may have Barry back.
I've resolved it.
Terrific. Excellent.
Well, I'll try and make my comments even more succinct. So, when I last spoke to you in late May, at that time, there was still a lot of pushback about the nature of this and the fact that it was unprecedented. And I had focused in on that 1980 Carter credit controls from the very early days in March because it was a government-mandated economic sudden stop. The ISM Manufacturing Index went from 50 in February to 29, which at the time actually looked like we might even have a deeper contraction to that. As it turned out, we only went to 41 and we're back in positive territory. GDP fell 8% in the second quarter of 1980. It fell 10% in 58 when we had a pandemic. We had the Asian flu. There were forecasts of 50% GDP declines earlier in this cycle. The New York Fed GDP nowcast is at 15. I think when all is said and done, we're probably going to wind up with something like, negative 10. So it actually looks a lot like those cycles. And in some ways, I heard it described as similar to a European summer, any summer, where they take 2 months off and then they come back. And in some ways, it is a little bit akin to that, even with the idea that we're now having this increased caseload in the Sun Belt. I spent this morning going through state-level jobless claims and a Dallas Fed mobility and engagement index to see, is there really a slowdown in the Sun Belt states? So I used Florida, California, and Texas, compared them to New York and New Jersey, and it's not there in the jobless claims data. Things are improving. We created a back-to-work proxy, which really helped get the labor market recovery correct. I had a much more optimistic forecast for May payrolls and then again for June payrolls by simply taking the cumulative increase in initial jobless claims, the media narrative that you hear that there's 45 million newly unemployed Americans, when in fact, continuing jobless claims are more like 18 million. So if you looked at that cumulative increase relative to the continuing numbers, and you looked at the weekly change, you could see this is a proxy for people going back to work. Even in the latest week, that was another 1.9 million workers. So what most people don't do is they don't look at the churn within the labor market. They simply look at the net numbers. The churn numbers have been fantastic. And to some of your earlier discussion about PPP and did it really help the labor market, those anecdotes that Michael was discussing, I was acutely attuned to that, having worked at Lehman Brothers and then Barclays back during the financial crisis. And sort of know what happens when the government lends you money, right? They're going to want it back plus then some. But if you just take the ADP employment report and you consider what's going on with small businesses, which is businesses with 1 through 49 employees, in April they lost 5.2 million workers. They've gained back 44% of those workers in the subsequent 2 months. Large employers, those are with 500 or more employees, they lost 9.3 million workers. Only 20% of those have come back, according to the ADP survey. The aggregate number for the economy is 28%. So the only thing you would conclude from that, or you never make definitive conclusions in economics. Nevertheless, the fact that you had such a strong comeback in small business employment relative to large business employment, PPP is a real probable catalyst for that. So, we are getting a sharp, sudden recovery, and it does look a lot like 1980 after all. And as I said, it doesn't really look like it's decelerating at this point, notwithstanding the increased caseloads.
Well, there's a lot that's encouraging there, although I will say that the last couple of months don't have much correlation to a 2-month European vacation, with the possible exception of my wine consumption. But other than that, yeah, but that's encouraging.
For sure.
Barry, thanks for joining us again. Great to have you here. You had a very optimistic outlook for recovery in the labor market, right? Prior to May and June employment reports coming out, and you were spot on in everything that you predicted. So interested to know what your process is, and give us an update on the progress of the recovery, especially given the latest jobless claims report that came out.
Yeah, sure. I kind of jumped ahead on that one a little bit when I went through what's going on with these the continuing claims relative to the cumulative increase in initial jobless claims. But listen, here's the way really to think about this, and this is a big conceptual change relative to what you hear on Wall Street most of the time from street economists or Federal Reserve economists. Prior to COVID, there were 150 million people employed in this country. Every month, we get very excited about whether we created 150,000 jobs, 0 jobs, or 300,000 jobs. 150,000 jobs divided by 150 million people is 10 basis points, 0.1%. Yet every month, 6 million people get a new job and 6 million people leave their job, 2/3 of which are voluntary. So if you take that 12 million churn per month, multiply it times 3, every quarter, 25% of the labor market turns over. That seems like a fantastic number, but when you consider that 40% of that comes from retail, leisure and hospitality, and construction, which were the sectors most impacted by the COVID shutdowns, you see that those workers are actually accustomed to being out of work for a month or so and then coming back and finding new jobs. So those are the most dynamic, high turnover sectors of the economy that really drive that churn, and those are the ones affected. So those are the people most mentally capable of dealing with all this, and that's in fact what is going on, is those jobs are churning. But to be sure, and I got asked this question on CNBC this morning, there's going to be a long tail to that. The things that Jeremy was talking about, I've discussed at length. I'm calling it Schumpeter's Gale, which is another term for creative destruction. I mean, you are clearly going to impair certain industries, and they may never come back. This question about what to do with commercial real estate that Michael was talking about is a big one. But yet you're going to drive productivity through the system. I mean, productivity, we had our weakest decade of productivity in the 2010s until the last 2 years, and that was primarily attributable to technology innovation adoption in places like Starbucks, right? They solved their assembly line process. Half the people or pre-order their coffee, come in and pick it up. So that acceleration of that process into 3, what I'm calling deadweight sectors, and healthcare, education, and housing. And by deadweight, I mean their price has been rising faster than overall prices, and their contribution to GDP has been going up, and they've been a real drag on productivity. So, this dynamic this whole Schumpeter's Gale creative destruction dynamic really does increase the productivity potential of U.S. growth going forward. So I'm really optimistic about that piece of it, but it is going to leave some people behind. And that's the residual question that's going to be the political hot button for the election coming this fall and then beyond.
So Barry, the Fed has stated repeatedly that they're not worried about inflation, and you have a Republican Treasury Secretary who said, and I quote, "I'll worry about the deficit later." But you believe, I think, that the 20s are going to be potentially more inflationary than the teens. Talk to us a little about your perspective on that. And frankly, it's what keeps me up at night.
There's three elements to my thesis on this. The first one is, you already alluded to it, which is, where does the debt reside, right? So going into the financial crisis, the debt was at the household level. We got to 100% of GDP, household debt to GDP. It had risen from the early 80s straight through to 2009. That deleveraging put downward pressure on goods prices and all sorts of prices as the households needed to deleverage. There was also massive leverage in the financial system. Reinhardt and Rogoff have done extensive work on this. The most persistent macroeconomic effect of a financial crisis is a decade of disinflation. This is not that. We did not have excessive leverage in the household sector. It's been falling for the entire decade. Same is true of the financial sector. The debt's at the government level, right? And that's how governments try and get their way out. Step number one, raise taxes. That doesn't work. It's like standing in a pail of water and pulling on the sides. Step number two is to try and drive inflation. And generally, governments are successful in driving inflation, but not paying down debt that way. So that's the sort of cyclical where the debt resides part of the argument. The more practical part of this, if you will, is if you just decompose inflation over the last 3 decades into services inflation, energy inflation, and goods inflation, all of the disinflationary pressure has come from the goods side. And that's a consequence of the biggest increase in labor in the history of the world, which is China and the Soviet bloc entering into the industrialized world. There were 750 million workers in 1990. By 2010, there were 2 billion. But those numbers have all rolled over and are starting to fade. So replacing capital with cheap Chinese labor is not going to be the tail of the tape in the 20s. And in fact, people will restructure supply chains because of the risks associated with that. And there's just that disinflationary force is going to dissipate. So then if you consider energy and services, those have actually not been that deflationary. So once you move that goods disinflation aside, and then you consider, where the debt resides, this is likely to be a decade where we've reached a turning point on a 30-year disinflationary trend. I'm not arguing that you'll have a big surge in inflation in 2021 like you did in the aftermath of World War II, although there's some parallels to that. But through the decade, it's likely that we will be in an uptrend, which has pretty serious implications for asset allocation and fixed income investing and the like as well. Real interest rates have probably seen the end of 4 decades of declines, as alongside that turn and expected to turn anyway in inflation.
Well, Barry, thank you. That was amazing. And Jeremy and Michael and our partner Rob Drobnak, who answered some of your questions here. What an amazing panel. Thank you all. There's a lot to chew on. I'm looking forward to going back and watching this again. And this will be available tomorrow on our site, nixonpeabody.com, for everybody to listen to. Chris, any final words?
Thanks, everyone, for your attendance as always, and we'll look forward to visiting with you again in 2 weeks.
Thank you, everybody.